we decided we wanted to do an online migration using the SQL Migration Extension. Today, we wrap up that series by starting a migration, monitoring that migration, and cutting over that migration, all using Azure CLI commands. On today's Tales from the Field.
Wake up, today's gonna be a good day. Wake up, today's gonna be a good day. Wake up, today's gonna be a good day.
If this is your first time finding us at Tales from the Field, hit that like and hit that subscribe button. Speaking of subscribers, those numbers keep going up, folks, as does our appreciation. Thank you so much for subscribing to the channel. And if you're new to the content and you like what you're seeing, hit that like and hit that subscribe. Speaking of content, we have a round table that we do every Tuesday where we share links and blogs and videos that are produced by you, the Azure data community, for the data community. Also, we have this thing that we like to call MS Tech Bits. It drops on Mondays and Wednesdays. You're watching one of those now. Let's get over to it. Welcome back to our video series on migrating our Azure SQL VM to a managed instance using the Azure SQL Migration Extension with Azure Data Studio. What have we covered so far? Well, we've launched our wizard in Azure Data Studio. We've run our assessment. We've collected our performance data. We've received a SKU recommendation. We've created our Azure Database Migration Service minus the self-hosted integration runtime because we are not doing a restore from on-premises. In this video, we're going to start and monitor the progress of our migration, and we're going to perform the migration cutover, all using CLI. Here you can see a brief reminder of the environment that we're using for this video. We're migrating our databases at scale using our Azure CLI commands. For this video, we're going to use the SQL Server to Azure SQL Managed Instance CLI commands. Let me touch on some of the common limitations I see overlooked when performing this type of migration. Each database needs to be contained within its own container, your fulls, your differentials, and logs. So each database must have its own container. You cannot overwrite an existing database, and a single LRS job created by the Data Migration Service can only run for 30 days. So I'm using Ola Halengrens Scripts to back up my databases to my blob storage account. Here you can see I'm doing a fold to a directory structure of null to URL with a number of files 4, so I'm striping it 4 ways. For my differential, I'm sending it to the directory structure of null, also to URL, and for my logs, directory structure of null to my URL. So let's take a look at what this looks like in our storage account. Here you can see I have my data backup storage. I have my Stack Overflow large container, and within this container, I have my full, my differential, and transaction log backups. Switching over to our jump box, let's look at the Azure CLI commands we ran in part 1 and part 2 of the video series. We ran our get assessment. We ran our performance data collection. We ran our get SKU recommendation. We also ran our SQL Service create to create our new data migration service. You can go back to videos part 1 and 2 to review those in more detail. Here's where things got a little tricky for me the first time I ever ran this Azure CLI command to start my migration. So let's walk through it here step by step. First thing I want to do is I want to build a sub ID, a subscription ID parameter, so we don't have to pass that in clear text. Here you can see I'm doing that. Next, I want to build this key ID parameter. This is going to get our access key from our storage account. We don't want to pass that in clear text either. I'm going to pass those into my source loc parameter here. Besides subscription, you can see here I'm going to pass in the sub ID parameter. For our resource group, we're going to put in the resource group name that contains our Azure storage account. For our Azure storage account, we're going to put data backup storage here. That's my Azure storage account. And then here for key ID beside account key, you can see that I'm passing in the key ID parameter I built previously. And then for our blob container, we're going to put Stack Overflow large. That's where we saw all of our backups, our full differentials and logs going to previously in this video. Okay, now we're going to run our AZ Data Migration SQL Managed Instance Create. For source location, we're going to pass in our parameter source loc. Then for migration service, besides subscriptions, we're going to put our sub ID. Beside our resource group, we're going to put data ADS migration. And for our SQL migration service, we're going to put date DMS prod CLI. For our scope, besides subscriptions, once again, we're going to pass in our sub ID parameter. For our resource group, this is going to be the resource group of our managed instance date ADS migration, and then our managed instance date primary MI. For our source database name, we're going to pass in Stack Overflow Large. That's the database that we're migrating from our source location. And then for our target DB name, we're going to type in Stack Overflow Large CLI. I'm giving it a different name since I already have a Stack Overflow Large database out there. Plus, I want to show that we can restore with the CLI. For resource group, this is going to be the resource group that contains our managed instance. And then for managed instance, we're going to type in date primary MI. That's the managed instance. That's our target location that we're moving our Azure SQL Server VM database to. Okay, with all those parameters in place, let's go ahead and run our command. As we execute our SQL managed instance create statement, at the bottom of the screen, we're going to get a relatively large JSON output about its provisioning state. Here in this screen, you can see that my provisioning state has succeeded. We also have some other Azure CLI commands we can execute to be able to see these different states of execution. We have our command AZ Data Migration SQL Managed Instance Show, and we can expand migration details. Let's run a query properties provisioning state. All right, once we execute that, you can see we get a very clear answer. Yes, our provisioning has succeeded. We don't have to parse through all that JSON. We could also run a query against that same command called using properties.migration status. If we run properties.migration status for the AZ Data Migration SQL Managed Instance Show, you can see here that we're in a restoring state. To get more detailed status of our restoring state, we could switch over to Azure Data Studio and we could run a select from DM exec request against our managed instance. And you can see there it gives us a percent complete. We could also switch over to our Azure Data Studio and we could go to the SQL Migration Extension. We could go to database migrations in progress. And you can see here that we have our Stack Overflow Large CLI in a restoring state. We could also click on the database name. It'll show us our migration status again. It'll show the backup location. It'll show our last uploaded file, and it'll show us our currently restoring file. So it gives us an idea of where we are in the migration process. Switching back over to our CLI commands, we can run our AZ Data Migration SQL Managed Instance Show, doing a query against our property migration status. And you can see here that our database is restored and we are ready for cutover. Now that we're ready for cutover, we're going to build a migration operation ID parameter by using the AZ Data Migration SQL Managed Instance Show and by querying properties migration operation ID. We're going to then take that parameter and we're going to plug it into our AZ Data Migration SQL Managed Instance Cutover. You can see there we're going to plug in some information, but this is where we're going to plug in our variable, the migration operation ID. With that command built out, we are now going to go ahead and execute that. With that executing, we will no longer get a command prompt here that will stay on that screen until it's complete. However, we can go over to Azure Data Studio and we can query sysdm HADR physical seating stats, and we can see the stats for each of our replicas in their seeding state. Remember, this is business critical. We're going to have 3 replicas that it needs to seed. Again, by querying our managed instance, we can get more detailed information on the seeding status of our replicas by querying DM exec request and filtering by command where it's like VDI. And you can see there we got percentage complete. We can see here on our screen that our cutover is complete because we've come back to the command prompt. Switching over to Azure Data Studio and running DMHADR physical seating stats one more time against our target managed instance, you can see there that our replica seating status has completed with a success. And to close it out, flipping over to Azure Data Studio SQL Migration Extension one more time, you can see here also that we successfully migrated our database utilizing the Azure SQL CLI commands. What did we cover today? We covered a lot. But first off, we need to be proud of ourselves because we have successfully cut over and migrated a database online by using our Azure Data Studio and our Azure CLI commands that come with the Azure SQL Migration Extension. In parts 1 and 2, we utilized both Azure Data Studio and CLI to get our assessments, to find our SKUs, to create our data migration service. In part 3, we utilized Azure Data Studio from end to end to do an online migration. And in this video, we completed our migration by starting our migration, doing the cutover, and monitoring the status of our migration by using Azure CLI and some SQL commands against our Azure managed instance. It's been a great series. You know where to keep it going down below in the comments, and always be good to each other.
Wake up, today's gonna be a good day. Wake up, today's gonna be a good day.